So, in this lecture, I want to focus on really three broad themes, and we're going to focus on the question of work, we're going to focus on the question of property, and we're going to focus on the question of banking, money, economy, society. And I think you'll see there's a logic to the fact that our first kind of substantive dive into specific issues last week was the question of church and state, because how you think about society and what a good society is and how the state relates to the church and how all that relates to kind of the final eschatological reckoning and the goal of society is directly going to impact how you think about these economic issues. So you can't tease these things apart and treat them totally separate. It's really a package, and as we talked about in really one of the first lectures, different kind of webs on the node or nodes on the web of how we think about things. So let's take this first broad theme of the question of work and a few questions that we want to ask about work. Is work a created good? Or is work really just a burden or a curse or a result of sin? And then if work is in some way a created good, what kinds of work are good? What kinds of work are not so good? If we can make that sort of distinction, what does it mean to do good work? And then, how should work be managed? Should work be managed by a professional class of managers? And if there is some kind of professional class of managers, how should labor be treated? What kind of rights, if any, should labor have? So let's just talk for a moment about this first bullet. And we can think about it using these frames or buckets that our text has given us of universal, subversive, and ecclesial ethics, and you'll find a lot of that information in the text itself. Generally, from the perspective of universal ethics, we probably would say that, yes, there is an aspect of work that is a created good, that is part of the natural created order. When we look at the story of the Garden of Eden, and again, we can kind of set aside whatever scientific issues we might have with that for now. Take my theology and science class, we'll talk about some of those. But as a narrative in Scripture, it's giving us at least a theological account of nature and work and what is right. And we see from the very beginning that the man and the woman are given the task of tending the garden and of being responsible for the animals and for the rest of the created order. So there's often in universal ethics that's seen as an implication that work originally is part of the created order. It's natural, it's good. People ought to do productive work. Now, of course, the universal side will recognize the doctrine of the fall and the fact that work is tainted and cursed and made difficult and made perhaps harsh, the thorns and the thistles and so on that the garden begins to produce in that narrative indicates that there are aspects of work that are not good, that are part of fallenness. And so part of our theology of work then from a universal perspective might be to try and understand what about the work that we do is part of our created nature. What about the way our work is constructed and put together reflects sinfulness or fallenness, and how can we begin to structure work and do work and think about work that gets back more toward the ideal of what work is supposed to be. So that's one way of thinking about it. From a subversive perspective, of course, there's going to be a lot of attention paid to the power dynamics in the way that we do work. Now, the subversive perspective isn't necessarily going to reject the universal perspective that work is part of a created good. In fact, I think many liberation theologians, for example, will talk about the dignity of work and the fact that there is an inherent dignity in work, but will emphasize the fact that the way the world is currently structured, a few wealthy, powerful elites are able to dominate the rest of the populace, and particularly disadvantaged populations, and cause their work to be particularly harsh, even close to being a form of slavery, if not literally being a form of slavery. So that will be a kind of analysis of work that will often be done from the subversive perspective. From the ecclesial perspective, perhaps the emphasis will be on, as you might expect, what's the relationship of our vocation, our calling, as laborers in whatever kind of labor we have, to the life of the church first, and then how does that relate to our life in the rest of society? Now, an interesting tension here, I think, and we've talked about this a little when we talked about the relationship between church and state, is kind of the inheritance of early and really medieval Christendom about work. And we mentioned that, certainly in the medieval period, there comes to be, broadly speaking, this notion that, there are those who work, there are those who fight, and there are those who pray. The people who work are the peasants working the farms and trades. The people who fight are the nobles, the knights, and so on. The people who pray are the priests, the monks, the bishops. And we mentioned that there came to be this sense that the people who pray really have a higher spiritual estate than the people who work. And we saw, looking at Martin Luther's letter to the German nobility, how that became a really significant tension during the period of the Reformation, and how the reformers, Luther in particular, Calvin as well, tried to create theologies of vocation and work that kind of got past that difference. So one of the challenges for ecclesial ethics today is to try and kind of incorporate that, and to see how all kinds of work relates to our life in the church. So that will be, a very general, broad sense of how those different perspectives will think about work. In terms of management, again, very different perspectives. From a universal ethic, there can be a sense in which certain kinds of universal ethics recognize that there's some kind of propriety in having certain people who have the calling or vocation to be managers, to be bosses, to be employers, in the language of the New Testament, right, to be masters, and who else, some people might have the vocation, at least at certain points in their life, to be employees, laborers, workers, and will then focus on the kind of values that a worker ought to have in trying to do good work and relating to the boss, and how the boss ought to respect and dignify the worker. So we can think of it that way. From the subversive perspective, very often the question of the division between management and labor is going to be subject to some severe criticism. And in fact, as we'll see in a moment, from some aspects of the subversive perspective, might even suggest that the distinction between management and labor, or between owners and workers, is one of the major theological, ethical problems we face. From the ecclesial perspective, perhaps the way to think about it is to think about what our relationships to each other are and ought to be within the church, and then how those relationships to each other within the church ought to spill out and influence the way that we do work in the world. And very often, one of the things that'll be emphasized here is the kind of leveling within the church, the fact that class distinctions, race distinctions, gender distinctions, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in the letters of Paul, really begin to be, in many ways, leveled down, and how that flows into the way we think about and the way we do our work. You might see, and I maybe would suggest, that between the universal and subversive and ecclesial perspectives on the general idea of work, the distinctions are a little bit more subtle. It's, I think, maybe a little bit more of a matter of emphasis. Who are we emphasizing? Whose plight, whose status are we emphasizing? All of those perspectives, I think, see a value in work and and see a value in the sense of vocation, but it's a difference in emphasis.